Okay, today's stuff we're going to be learning is Kufyu Gimel, a little bit simpler than yesterday's stuff. Still a lot of details, but not at all the, gymnastics we did yesterday of all those cases. I'll just remind you, the Siyum is next Thursday. We haven't yet gotten the registration up for all sorts of various reasons, but it's going to go up within the next 2 days, and barring any, we'll see how long the strike lasts in Israel. But anyway, God willing, it will get up soon. But it's Thursday night. Put it in your calendars. It's a great program. I don't want to get into all the details now, but it'll all go up within the next few days. Bezrat Hashem. Okay, not everything's always in our hands. Okay, we're going to get started now with starting from where it says Gemara, 7 lines from the bottom of Kuf Yud Bet Amud Bet. Amar Rami bar Chama. Mishnah, we're not dealing with all those crazy cases in the Mishnah. We're dealing with the beginning part of the Mishnah and like some of the basic principles. And what we're going to do right now is make a comparison between the different cases that either have validity to marriage on a rabbinic level, like we saw, let's say a Ketana whose mother or brother married her off and it only has rabbinic validity, and a chereshet who gets married who has rabbinic validity. We're also going to compare that to certain cases where there is no rabbinic validity. For example, a katan can't marry a woman. There's no validity. Only a ketana can either be married off by her father, and then it'll be deoraita, Torah, or she can get married off by her mother or brother if the father's not in the picture, right? We saw different reasons why the father might not be in the picture. I'm not going to get into all that, but then it has rabbinic validity. So we're going to start comparing all these things and why this yes, why that no, why this kind of woman gets a ketubah, why this woman doesn't get a ketubah, all sorts of comparisons. That's the whole first section of our daf. So Rami bar Chama starts off and says, Amar Rami bar Chama, Mashna cheresh v'chereshet ditakinu la Rabbanan nisuin. The rabbi said, theoretically, a chereshet are like someone, usually they're considered in halacha, they're considered ein bahem da, they don't have knowledge. Okay, they don't have understanding, maybe would be a better way to say it. Today, we're going to see, by the way, all sorts of grays here, okay, where things aren't as black and white, katan, cheresh, shoteh, as if they have no dot at all. Okay, we're going to get into different fine tunings of it, which is really, really interesting. So why did the rabbi say their marriage is valid when it comes to Maishna de shoteh v'shotah delot kinulu rabbanan nisuin? Again, shoteh v'shotah, someone who doesn't have, they have limited mental capabilities, maybe is the best way to say it. I'm always struggling with how to define this word because it's a very hard word to define. In fact, you're going to see today that there's different levels, obviously. So they say their marriage is not valid at all, not on a rabbinic level. Okay, obviously none of these have marriage by Torah law, but the cheresh and chereshet do have marriage by rabbinic law. Ditanya. So first of all, how do we know that they don't have, their marriage is not valid at all? Because it says, shoteh, not only a shoteh, also a katan, as I mentioned a minute or two ago, also a minor, a male minor, shenasu nashim v'metu, if they married women and they died without children, nishotehem p'tuot min hachalitza min yibum. There's no chalitza, there's no yibum because, right? If it was rabbinic, there would be chalitza at least, right? Not yibum because, right, you can't marry the brother, but at least you would do chalitza. This has no marriage status at all. So now what's the answer? Cheresh v'chereshet dekaima takanta de Rabbanan takinu l'Rabbanan nisuin. It's very hard to understand what this word is. Kaima takanta de Rabbanan. It's not the way Rashi defines it. Certainly doesn't seem to fit in with the words 100%. But what Rashi says, if you look at the kaima takanta de Rabbanan, shedarkam liyot shalom beinehem afilu chereshim chereshet. They can live happily, peacefully in a marriage together. There's no reason a deaf mute person can't live with another deaf mute person. Or even with someone, and Rashi even says, even with a pikachat, right? I think he says it also, right? The koshking shaish pikach, or the more so, he even says, or the more so if the man is a pikach, they can live together very nicely. And therefore, tikinu l'Rabbanan nisuin, the rabbi said there's a valid marriage. But shoteh v'shotah, now this is a bit of a difficult sentence, de lo kaima takanta de Rabbanan, where the rabbis don't assume you can live happily, okay? They assume someone who's not of sane mind, right, is very unstable, can have episodes of, not like crazy episodes and things like that. And he says, because of that, they can't really live together in any peaceful kind of way. Okay, it's a very harsh comparison. You would never live together with a snake in a very small space. So you wouldn't, a shoter or shotah wouldn't be a good companion. Therefore, lotzkinu Rabbanan Nisuin. Okay, again, this has to be taken, as we say, be'eravon mugbal in Hebrew, right? With an understanding that there's a big range here. In fact, later we're going to talk about a range, and that there's a range of, the way nowadays, if you would get you get tested if you have any issues like this. So there'd be, mild, average and severe. So there's obviously a range here, and they're obviously talking about a more severe case where you really can't function living with another person in a marriage relationship. So therefore, they said marriage is not relevant here. So we're not gonna say there's validity to the marriage. Okay, what about katan? Okay, katan could theoretically be in a marriage. As I told you, we're going to keep comparing things. So what about this minor? A minor, why not? Theoretically, you could be 11 years old, and theoretically, again, it's hard for us to imagine you be in a marriage relationship, but, theoretically, and yet a cheresh tkinu l'Rabbanan Nisuin. Do you remember we learned about davar sheyesh lo matirin when it comes to laws of nullification, and we said if something will become permitted down the road, so we don't allow the regular laws of nullification to work, like if it's chametz, or I don't know, maybe that's always a bit of a question, but anyway, if it's something that will become permitted to you down the road, like chametz right now, but it'll become permitted after Pesach, so laws of nullification don't apply. So therefore, they say the same thing here, the same principle. The cheresh will never get there, and unless they get cured, but assuming they're not going to get cured, so they don't necessarily have a chance to ever get married. So therefore, we'll allow them to get married in their current state. Whereas the katan, there was no need to say your marriage is valid. Just wait a few years, and then your marriage will be valid. Okay, so wait a minute. What do we say about a minor? She can be married off by her mother or brother, right? In the case where there's no do right and the father's not marrying them off. So, the rabbi said, we can give her marriage. Why would that be then? Why? She'll also eventually become of age. Why? What's the rush, right? It's like, what's the rush to get people married so young, especially so young, we're talking really young in our minds. We're worried that the more the women are not betrothed, they're prey for men who might try to take advantage of them. And we saw this already yesterday. We're going to see it again today with the shotah. Someone who becomes a shotah who is married to someone, and then we can't divorce her for that reason, right? They're very worried. And it's interesting, right? They're very worried about protecting the women from, bad things, bad people that are out there. So therefore, the rabbi said, let her get married, because otherwise we're worried what people might do to her. So once we have Ktana is derabanan, if her mother or brother marry her off, chereshet ilemet is derabanan. So theoretically, the law should be the same. If a Ktana, it's only derabanan, so she can do miyun and just easily get out of the marriage. Why don't we say the same thing with a chereshet ilemet? So they say, Masha chereshet lo mimana, right? So why a Ktana mimana? She can do miyun, and a chereshet can't. De'im ken mimna'e v'lo nasbeh. And they're trying to get into the heads of people. Say, listen, if we allow miyun for a chereshet, who on earth would ever marry her? You're going to live your entire life thinking one day she could just turn around and walk out. Even a man who wants to divorce his wife has to go through a process of divorce. All she has to do is wake up and say, I don't want to be married to you, and walk out the door. No one's going to want that for their whole lives. When it's a ktana, so it's limited in time, so we can do it. But when it's forever, because assuming her status is not going to change, therefore, we're not going to allow that, because no one would ever want to marry her. And again, we're going to see this as we go on. We want to encourage people to marry these Chershot Umot. We don't want them on the streets, right? We want to encourage them to get married. So therefore, we need to encourage the men to marry them, so we don't allow miyun. So what they're basically saying is, theoretically, you could have allowed miyun, but we're not going to, because it would create a situation where people wouldn't marry them. Again, we're going question after question comparing these situations. Why is a ktana? Why does she get to eat truma? When she marries someone, she can eat truma, whereas a chereshet can't eat truma. In other words, if she marries a Kohen, she can't eat truma, the chereshet. The Abat Yisrael who marries a Kohen who's a ketana, she can eat truma. Ditnan, how do we know this, first of all? Well, He'id Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgeda al chereshet shisi'a avia sheyotza beget. It was a deaf, he testified about a case that, or just in general, that if there's a deaf woman whose father marries her off, she can get divorced with a get. In other words, she needs to get divorced with a get, meaning there's validity to that marriage. The second thing he testified about was a minor who was a Bat Yisrael, who married a Kohen, and she was able to eat truma. Now notice what doesn't say here. It doesn't say the chereshet could eat truma if she marries a Kohen. So ilu chereshet lo achla. We can infer from here that the chereshet can't eat truma. So from there we learn both that a ketana can eat truma and a chereshet can't. So again, if they're all married to Rabbanim, what's the difference? So they say it's a gzera. Why can't she do it? Because shema ya'achil cheresh becheresh. We're worried that if you had a male cheresh who's a Kohen, that he would end up feeding his chereshet wife truma, and that doesn't work. Okay, he can't feed his chereshet wife truma. Okay, just one second. Right, there's a long Rashi about this as to why exactly. Okay, but let's just take it as a given right now, because otherwise we'll never get through the stuff. But basically, a cheresh Kohen can't feed his chereshet wife truma, because again, first of all, the marriage is to Rabbanan, even though the ketana is also marriage to Rabbanan, but we allow. Well, again, there the marriage is d'oraita. Okay, no, it's not, because she's a chereshet. Okay. Anyway, the point is, a ketana, shouldn't say it right? She's d'Rabbanan. They're both d'Rabbanan, but ketana we're going to allow truma. This we're not going to allow truma. So because the cheresh, if he's a Kohen, he doesn't allow his wife a cheresh to eat truma. So then they say, a fascinating line, which we're going to deal with a lot tomorrow. The Gemara is going to keep going on and only get back to this at the end of today's daf, which is really we're going to start tomorrow. V'lechol, we're not going to make a gzera in case the cheresh feeds the cheresh a truma. Why? Because what's the difference if she does? Okay, yeah, she's not allowed to eat truma, but remember, she's a chereshet ilemet. Now, chereshet ilemet is not punishable. She doesn't get punished for sins she does. She's considered a person who doesn't really have da'at, right? The cheresh and katan are always in that category. So what if he feeds her truma? So worst case, she ate truma, but it's bad, but she's not obligated to mitzvah. And because of that, the Beit Din is not obligated to stop her from doing averot, which means that the Beit Din doesn't need to institute a gzera just in case, right? Don't let a cheresh eat truma, just in case she ends up marrying a cheresh, and he's a Kohen, and he'll think, right, that he can allow his wife to eat truma. So in the words of the Gemara, v'lecho, katan ochal nevelotu, fascinating line. It's no different than a child eating nevel, right, an animal that just died on its own, and the kid gets up and starts cooking it and eats it. We're not commanded to stop a child from doing that. Fascinating. You would have thought, of course, we're commanded to stop a child from eating non-kosher food, right? If you saw your kid eat non-kosher, right, walk into a McDonald's and start buying a cheeseburger, right? Of course, you'd stop your child. According to this, the courts are not commanded to stop a child from doing that. In other words, there's rules of tochacha, telling people not to do things, not a child. Okay, and we're going to talk about this tomorrow. Is this really true? Fascinating topic. So anyway, because of that, the Gemara says, so what if a cheresh feeds his chereshet wife? Chereshet, okay, so she eats truma. We don't have to start instituting, forbidding other cases just in case that happens. To which they say, okay, fine, it's not that. It's gzera shemiyachil cheresh b'pikachat. We're worried that he'll end up feeding his wife who's a pikachat, which is a problem. So then they say, the cheresh b'pikachat nami lecho b'truma d'Rabbanan. Okay, she can't eat truma d'oraita. Why? Because they're not married on a Torah level, but they are married on a rabbinic level. So let him feed her truma d'Rabbanan. To which they say, okay, it's true, he can't. But again, this wasn't really a good question. The whole reason why we don't allow a chereshet to eat truma or a cheresh to, right, is because why can't a chereshet eat truma? We're worried if we feed her truma, people will think that a cheresh kohen can feed his wife truma. And if that's the case, then he might feed his pikachat wife, who's forbidden to eat truma, right? And he might feed her truma d'oraita. And for that reason, we don't allow it. Okay, so it took a while to get there, but in the end, we have our reason. Next question. Why does a minor who gets married have a ketubah, but a chereshet doesn't get a ketubah? The answer is, again, we go back to this. He won't want to marry her if he has to give her a ketubah. In other words, What's a ketubah? Financial commitment of the husband. Now, the whole idea here, we go back to what it said at the very top of the daf, which is we want to encourage people to marry these chirshot. We don't want to leave them on the street. So in order to do that, one of the ways they do it is say, oh, you actually don't have to give her a ketubah. Okay. And that encourages the men to marry her because here they have a wife they can marry without having this big financial burden. You have to realize that the ketubah was a big financial concern of the husband. He had to, basically any property he sold was connected to the ketubah, right? He could have issues selling land because people say, oh, well, if you don't pay your ketubah, they're going to come and demand this land from me, right? So it was a big financial burden. So they basically said, okay, you don't have to give her ketubah, and that will encourage men to marry these chirshot omot. So these deaf mutes. So now they say, okay, well, ketana minalan de'itle ketubah. So first of all, how do we know that a ketana has a ketubah? Ditnan, as it says in the Mishnah, hamima'enet, okay, we're now in a Mishnah in ketubot. Hamima'enet va'ashniya va'ailonit ein lahem ketubah. If a woman, a ketana, decides she was married off by her mother or brother and says, I don't want to be married to this guy, she obviously doesn't get her ketubah money. That's clear, right? She's basically saying it was as if we were never married. Also, if somebody marries a shniya, that means she marries a relative who's forbidden by rabbinic law to her. She doesn't get her ketubah because that's not a valid marriage. Ailonit, remember we learned he's not supposed to marry an ailonit because she's supposed to give him children. So also, she doesn't get a ketubah. But what else does it say here? Aval, if we go back to this ketana though, who could do miyun, it says yotz'a beget ketana. You're supposed to get rid of the vav there. Some of the commentaries get rid of the vav. It makes more sense. Yotz'a beget ketana. In other words, if ketana leaves with a get, meaning she didn't do miyun, he divorces her. Now, what's a ketubah? In the case of death or divorce of the husband, she gets the money. Yesh la ketubah, then she will get her ketubah money. So here you see a ketana gets her ketubah. Now, we gave a reason why a chereshet doesn't get a ketubah, but we didn't say how we know that she doesn't get a ketubah. Titania, it says in the following, Braita, cheresh v'shoteh. He was deaf or a deaf mute, or he was not of sound mind. Shenasu pikchot, that they married women who were competent. Even though they were healed and were totally fine in the middle of the marriage, everything's fine. But it started off when they got married, they were not. Ein lahem alehem klum. They're not considered married at all, okay? And the wives have no claim of marriage, nothing. But ratzula kaiman, if at that point they decide we want to stay married, then yesh lahem ketubah, okay, it should say ketubah maneh. They get a ketubah, half the value of a regular ketubah. We're going to get to this ketubah. Okay, usually it's 200 zuz if she's a betula, a virgin. Since this woman, it's actually ironic, but she's not a virgin because of him. But because right now she's not a virgin, and this is as if like when the marriage is really taking effect, then she only gets half the value of a regular ketubah. And right, upikeh, and which seems clear she didn't have before, right? Now we get to our things. We want to know that wasn't a chereshet, that was a pikacha, right? He was cheresh, or shoteh. But what if there was a pikach that married a chereshet? Okay, so he was of sound mind, he was fine, and he married a deaf mute, shotah, or she was not of sound mind. Afil katav la mea maneh. If he decides to give her 100 maneh, that's 100 times this ketubah of the other person we just said, 50 times more in regular ketubah, like they're just saying a crazy amount of money, or exaggerating. Ketubah takayemet, the ketubah is valid. Why? Because he decided to give her a crazy amount of money, but not that he needed to. So now, right, he knew what he was doing. He knew he was squandering his money, okay, but he agreed to it, so there's nothing to be done. But what do you see here? Tama deratza. If he wanted to, he could commit to her all this money. Ha lo ratza, ein la. One can infer from here, though, if he didn't want to give her, he didn't have to give her anything, okay, and it's only because he promised her this. So that's where we prove that a chereshet doesn't get a ketubah. So we prove that a ketana gets a ketubah. We saw it inside. We saw it inside now, at least in inference, that a chereshet doesn't get a ketubah. We explained why a chereshet doesn't get a ketubah, because otherwise people won't want to marry her. And now they say, right, and why? They say again, right? Because in general, men would be deterred from marrying her if they had to promise her money. So now they say, wait a minute. if we're going to say that people generally don't really want to marry deaf mutes and we need to provide incentive clauses, so let's do the reverse. If she's a deaf mute, and it's clear, he doesn't have to give her ketubah so that she'll get married. Someone will marry her. What if he's a deaf mute and we want him to get married? So what do we say? Let's encourage women to marry him by insisting that he has to give them a ketubah. And that way they'll want to marry him because they're promised all this money in the end. They're promised protection. So, but it's not the case, right? A cheresh doesn't have to give a ketubah either. So they say, right? Why? If a pikacha marries a cheresh, we should institute ketubah in that case. So what do they answer? Right? And they say, because then otherwise she won't want to marry him if she doesn't get a ketubah. So you ready for the big line? Okay. Okay, women would always prefer to get married. In other words, we're not worried that a woman won't want to marry this deaf mute because if her prospects are limited, right, she'll be happy to marry this deaf mute because women would always prefer to be married. Men don't have that same preference to always want to be married. Okay, I remember learning this line in high school in Kiddushin, comes up as in a different wording, Tov lemetav tandu mi lemetav ormelo. I never forgot those words. Even though when I was in high school, those words didn't mean anything to me, but Tov lemetav tandu, it means better to sit with married, right, with someone else, mi lemetav ormelo, from to sit by yourself. Okay, so, and that's a woman's line. Okay, so obviously, you can't not relate to this, right? Two ways of either this was in their day, and in those days, clearly women always wanted to be married because no financial security if they weren't married, right? Their fathers can't support them all their lives. They needed a husband to support them. They want to have children, maybe you could say more, right? All sorts of reasons. You could say this is purely financial security. Right? And it's not relevant nowadays. On the other hand, you could also say there's more emotional needs of women. Some people will tell you this is still true today, right? Good. I'm going to leave it up as an open question. Obviously, like I told you today, there's a lot of shades of gray. I'm sure in this area, there's a lot of shades of gray today. Some women would rather be married more so than men. Some men would rather be married more so than women. Could you say this as a general rule, right? Possibly, possibly not. Anyway, it's always interesting to see these kind of lines. And again, understand them in the context of when they were, and, to question whether this is possibly still true or not. But what's interesting about it is this affects halacha, because then that means that a cheresh doesn't have to give a ketubah to his wife because, again, there's no nisu in midoraita, so there's no need for ketubah. But, right, would you do this as an incentive clause, right? Would this be needed today? It would be a good question because maybe we do need to incentivize people to marry people who are deaf mute. So it's a fascinating question. Okay, now we have a case. Now, remember, we said that a cheresh that marries a pikacha doesn't need a ketubah, and it seemed very clear. But this story seems to say otherwise. So if you talk about black and white and grays, okay, here it goes. And it's a crazy story. Crazy in a particular way. Okay, we've seen crazier stories. But there was a deaf mute who was in the neighborhood of Rav Melchiah. In Sebeitita, he married him off to a woman, okay, meaning I guess he performed the marriage or, arranged things. Remember, cheresh can't really do things on his own as well. So he kind of helped things. What did he do? He said, I'm promising her on behalf of the cheresh 400 zuz, which is double the amount of a regular ketubah, from his money to this woman, okay? Meaning not from Rav Melchiah's money. He promised it from the Cheresh's money. Cheresh Leim somehow had money, we don't know, but he had a lot of money. And he committed the guy's money to the ketubah, okay, in order to incentivize the wife to marry him. So, right, exactly opposite of what we just said. Amarava, man chakim ke Rav Melchiah tegavar Rabbi. Wow, what a smart guy this guy is. Kasavar, he must have thought like this. In other words, the question is, upon what right did he have to go into Rav Melchiah, to the deaf person's money and commit all this money to the woman? So he says like this. Some women might not like this, but think about it again with the glasses of Talmudic times. A wife provides a man, and even nowadays, right? And a man provides a wife as well with certain services, okay? Basically, right? They'll take care of them. If they're sick, they'll do all sorts of things for them. They'll, help take care of the house. Again, the husband might do the same, but all these things in those days, especially the woman was in charge of the house. Now, if you don't have a woman in charge of the house, what do you have to do? You have to hire a slave woman to do all these jobs. So if he needed a shifcha to take care of him, especially, by the way, if he's a deaf mute and maybe has less mental capabilities, he'll all the more so need someone to help. So Milos of Ninale, would I not be able to take his money and hire a shifcha? So if I anyway would have taken that money and put it toward a shifcha, I may as well put it toward a wife. Koshken hacha di katarte. You get more. You get two things, right? Besides it, you get a shifcha, you also get a wife for chayeshu, and that's like a huge advantage. So again, it's putting a woman in a view of like a shifcha, but on the other hand, there's truth to this, right? She'll take care of him in a way that certain things that a shifcha might have done. So, and she provides a lot more than a shifcha. So it's worth putting the money into because you're getting more for your money, almost as you say. Okay, fascinating story. And again, it seems to contradict what we just said. There's no need to incentivize, but here clearly they were incentivizing this woman to marry him. So again, you see, it's not always black and white. I'm Rav Chia bar Ashi, I'm Shmuel. We're now going to have Rav Chia bar Ashi saying in the name of Shmuel, one version that says one way and one version that says exactly the opposite. Now we get into this whole issue about a cheresh. He marries someone. What kind of marriage is it? It's a marriage on a rabbinic level. Why is it a marriage on a rabbinic level? Is it that we view her as we view him as possibly of sound mind, possibly not of sound mind? Like, how do we view this? And therefore, also, what are the effects? If his wife, so now he's married to her on a rabbinic level, does she have to bring, let's say she sleeps with somebody else. So that's Eshet Ish, but she's not exactly Eshet Ish because it's only rabbinic. So on a Torah level, she's not an Eshet Ish at all. So he says she doesn't have to bring an Asham Taloi. Asham Taloi is, if, let's say a man sleeps with her, you might say, well, why is it rabbinic? Because maybe he does have that, maybe he doesn't. Maybe it's valid on a Doraita level, in which case maybe she is an Eshet Ish. And maybe she should have to bring, what's an Asham Taloi? Asham Taloi, I'll go back to a basic case. So is you eat a piece of chelev, okay, it's forbidden fats, or you eat a piece of fat, and you don't know, is it the forbidden fats of the animal or the non-forbidden fats of the animal? It's only for behemot, not for chayot, for domesticated animals. You eat this thing, you don't know what it is. So until such time that you figure out what it is, you bring an Asham Taloi. That gives you atonement until you figure out. If you figure out that it was in fact chelev, you have to bring a korban chatat. So this woman, we don't really know, is she married or not? So maybe you'd have to bring an Asham Taloi. So he says no, which seems to indicate there's no validity to this at all on a Torah level. And that's why there's no Asham Taloi. Asham Taloi will only be if there's some Torah doubt. So Lema Masehale, let's prove this statement of Shmuel from the following Mishnah. First Mishnah in Trumot. Chamisha lo yitchomu. There's 5 people who shouldn't take Truma. Im termu ein trumatan truma. And if they separated the Truma, it has no validity whatsoever. Okay? It's as if it's not Truma at all. Remember, Truma has all sorts of stringencies about it. If it becomes tamei, you have to burn it. It has to go to the kohen, etc. All sorts of. But it's irrelevant what they did. Elohim cheresh shotev katan. Okay, there you have it. Cheresh, their truma is totally invalid. Meaning, even right lechumra, we don't have to worry about it. Likewise with their marriage, there's no asham taloi at all. Okay, we're getting to numbers 4 and number 5 here. Someone who gives truma on someone else's produce without their permission, or if I asked a Gentile to take my truma, and I told them to, their truma is not truma. A Gentile can't take truma. Okay, I'm not going to get into all these details, but in any case, ein trumatan truma. So that seems to support this, that there's zero validity at all to this marriage on a Torah level. And that's why their truma is not even truma. So they say, no, not necessarily. You could say that Shmuel was talking, Hudama Rabbi Elazar. Maybe he was holding like a different opinion about truma. What's that opinion? Ditanya. Rabbi Yitzchak Omer Mishum Rabbi Elazar. Trumat cheresh lo tetzeh lechulim mipnei shu safek. He treats truma as a safek. Okay? Now, maybe Shmuel holds like that, which then we have to explain. So then why isn't she chayav and Asham Taloi if it's a safek? And you have to treat it as truma misafek. Isfira ki Rabbi Elazar Asham Taloi nami l'chayav. Well, then he should be chayav and Asham Taloi, or she should be chayav, right? Or someone who sleeps with her should be. Ve'ina d'chatika mishtei chatichot. Now, the way I explained the case was I have a piece of something, I ate it, I'm not sure what I ate, I bring an Asham Taloi. Maybe he holds that in that case, you wouldn't bring an Asham Taloi. So even though this woman is safek married to the cheresh on a Torah level, safek not married to him at all on a Torah level, and that's why we get to Derabanan it is. even then she wouldn't have to bring an Asham Talui. Why? The only way you're chayav, again, there's a debate about this, but maybe he holds you need chaticha mishtei chatichot. In order to be chayav an Asham Talui, it's like, let's say I almost get into a car accident. Does that mean I should say Birkat HaGomel? I didn't get into a car accident. It was close, right? Nothing really happened. So you can think about it a little bit in that way, which is if he sleeps with this woman who's maybe married, maybe not married, he doesn't have to bring an Asham Talui. Or if he eats this piece of fat and we don't know what it is it not? Maybe he ate something chaylev, maybe he didn't eat anything at all. It's different from the accident case. The accident, I was just saying, right? Because maybe nothing happened at all. So when do you do it? Well, maybe the accident wasn't a great comparison, but I'll tell you anyway what it is. So now it's when there's two pieces in front of him. One we know is chaylev and one we know is shuman. Okay? So in the case I described was maybe I'll try to compare it to the accident. Maybe that, right, there was almost an accident, but there wasn't anything in the end. So when there's when there's a suffix, whether there was even chaylev at all, then no. It's a matter of, let's say there were two plates in front of me. One definitely had chaylev and one definitely had shuman, regular fat. And I ate one of them and I'm not sure which one I ate. So there was definitely an eating of something and there was a 50-50 chance that something was chaylev as opposed to something I just don't even know what it was. So that's when I'm obligated. That's not applicable to this woman. It's not a case where there's two women and one is a cheresh, one is definitely married, one was not married, and we don't know which one he slept with. That would be a case where you bring an Asham Talui and an Eishet. This case is not that case. So therefore, we're going to say that must be why. So theoretically, we're saying he could hold like Rabbi Elazar. He doesn't have to hold like this Mishnah, in which case the Mishnah doesn't support him. Maybe he really thinks there is a suffix that maybe she's married on a Torah level. It's just that you wouldn't need Asham Talui because that's not how Asham Talui works. Well, then you're basically saying he holds like Rabbi Elazar. Well, there's a problem because Rabbi Elazar doesn't require chaticha mishtei chatichot in order to give an Asham Talui. So if he holds like Rabbi Elazar, we're going to assume he holds like him across the board. And mi by Rabbi Elazar chaticha mishtei chatichot, he doesn't require that for Asham Talui. Hatanya, it says in the Braita, Rabbi Elazar Homil. How do we know this? Because he says, koi chayavim al chabo Asham Talui. What's koi? Koi is an animal that we're not sure. It's some sort of buffalo, possibly. We're not sure if it falls in the category of domesticated animals or non-domesticated animals. If it's a non-domesticated animal, then you're not obligated in chaylev. If it's a domesticated animal, you are obligated. You're liable if you ate the chaylev. So if you eat the fat of a koi, the chaylev of a koi, do you bring an Asham Talui? According to Rabbi Elazar, you do. Now that's not chaticha mishtei chatichot. That's one thing that we just don't know what it is. And that's exactly like our women. So Rabbi Elazar, even though he holds his truma like lechumra, he wouldn't hold that you bring an Asham Talui here. So you can't say Shmuel holds like Rabbi Elazar, to which the Gemara says, of course you can. Shmuel savar like Rabbi Elazar b'chada, upelag b'chada. He holds like him when it comes to the cheresh's truma. It's something, and therefore his marriage does possibly have validity on a Torah level, right? It's suffix, but you wouldn't bring an Asham Talui because he doesn't agree with him about what requires Asham Talui. That's the first reading. The second reading is much simpler. You get Amri Amar of Chia Bar Hashem Shmuel Eshet Cheresh Chayavim Aleh Asham Talui. She is obligated in Asham Talui. Then we're going to, instead of bringing the Mishnah as a proof, we're going to bring the Mishnah as a contradiction. Which includes the Cheresh. His actions are invalid entirely. So why would you say she needs an Asham Talui? Sever like Rabbi Elazar. She must hold like Rabbi Elazar, and then needs an Asham Talui perfectly like Rabbi Elazar across the board, even if it's one chaticha, not a chaticha mishtei chatichot. You'd be obligated an Asham Talui. So now comes a really interesting question. By Rav Ashi, my time to Rabbi Elazar. Why does he say this cheresh is suffix yes, suffix no? Is it mifsha pshitale? And I told you we're going to get into a lot of grays here. Very interesting. Mifsha pshitale de cheresh data klishtahu. Is it because it's obvious to him that the cheresh has less dat than anyone else, less than the norm? Okay. This, by the way, if you go do a test for, mental capabilities, there's a whole range. Are you on the border of normal? Are you mild? Do you have benoni, average, or severe? So this is the question, right? Where is he on a scale? It's clear that there's a scale here. So it's clear he has less than normal, okay? But miumasapkale idata siluta, moving on a bit, ilav data siluta. What's the question? Does he have enough of a sound mind, though, to be able to make a decision about a marriage or about truma, or right? In other words, do we consider them lucid enough that they can make certain decisions? Ula olam chadadata. But according to this logic, he's always got the same mental capabilities. It's stable. Odilma, it's just lower than average. And then the question of safek, and as again, the question is, why does Rabbi Elazar view it as a safek? The safek is it enough knowledge to be able to say his actions are valid or not, right? Because it's what we would call in Hebrew gvuli. It's on the border there, right? Between normal and less than normal. Odilma pshita le data klishta, v'lav data tziluti, or maybe it's obvious that they don't have dat, their dat is below the norm. But maybe they have moments of lucidity and moments of not. And then the question becomes, right? So, you might test them one day, an IQ test, and they'll be below that average. But you might find that in another time, another moment, they're clearly with you all the way. So if that's the case, right, and then that's the question they're asking, according to Rabbi Elazar, what's your, and then it depends, it's variable, it changes. So that's the question. How do we view, what's the suffix? Is the suffix that they're stable, and the stability, it's just a question of at what level are they stable? Where do you put them on the scale? Or is it clear they're below the scale, but there might have moments where they're above the scale? So l'may nafkamina, what's the relevance? So now they say, lotzi ishto beget. If a cheresh gets married to someone, and then they want to divorce her, can they? So if you say they're just at a lower level and we're going to consider their marriage valid, like we said, so we're going to consider their divorce as valid as their marriage was, right? We talked about this. Just like they came in berimiza, they could go out berimiza, right? They can indicate their intent. Yes, you can go out the same way you came in. But that it's variable and it goes ups and downs all the time. You can get married, meaning, now, what it means really here is the marriage will be valid lechumra, right? Because maybe at the moment he was sane, in which case his wife will be considered a married woman. But you can't get her out of it out of safek. We don't know, was he lucid at the time that he did the divorce? So therefore, it might not be valid at all. So then you won't be able to get divorced. So which one is it? We don't really know what Rabbi Elazar's safek was. Okay, but it's very interesting to hear the way they discuss. You think, they just viewed everything black and white, not at all. It's clear that they understood there were ranges and ranges of viewing things. We're going to continue with this also down further on. Nishtatet. Okay, now we talked about a case where someone was of sound mind when they got married, and then she became a shota. And we said that he can't divorce her on a rabbinic level. So Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Dvar Torah, shota mitgaresh. On a Torah level, he can divorce her, because we already said she doesn't need her intent, so it doesn't matter if she's a shota. Although we'll see that's not necessarily true. But right now we're going to assume, just like you can divorce someone against their will, even if they're totally sound mind. So likewise, you can divorce her because her will is not relevant. So why did they say she can't get divorced? You can't divorce her. Right? We saw this before, so that people don't treat her like she's on the street and they can take advantage of her. We want to protect her. So now they say, hey, chidami, what kind of shota are we talking about? Again, we get into range, okay? It's two issues that we were talking about. Number one, does she know, can she get a star? Because get is a star. She has to get it and know to take care of a star. She can take care of a star, and she can take care of her own body, meaning she can protect herself from someone who's going to try to sleep with her on the street, but she knows how to protect her own body. Minag minhag hefker. Well, then obviously we're not worried about this minhag hefker. You can give her a divorce and no problem. She can keep her get, and we're not worried about her being on the street. But if there's neither, in other words, she's going to be minhag hefker because she can't watch herself, but she doesn't know enough to even watch her get, well, then we're going to learn right now, you can't marry her. Okay. How can you say you can't divorce her. How can you say Dvar Torah shota mitgareshet? On a Torah level, she can get divorced. She actually can't get divorced, even though we said a woman doesn't need intent or her wanting to get divorced. You can divorce her against her will. Again, Rabbeinu Gershom changed all that. Nowadays, you can't. In those days, you could. But there's a separate criteria that she doesn't have, which is ha'amri debei Rabbi Yanav and atam biyada. You have to give it into her hand. That means basically you have to give it into her domain. But misheyesh la yad garesh atzma. She doesn't have a hand. Doesn't mean she doesn't have a hand. She has a hand. But what does a hand mean? A hand means I can accept this and understand what I'm accepting. She has to understand. She doesn't have to, well, we'll see later. Maybe she doesn't have to fully understand, but she has to understand the basic of getting a star and being able to watch over it. She can't do that. She can't even get divorced. And if you don't buy that drasha, here's another one. Tana de Rabbi Ishmael, v'shilchami beito. What else happens in divorce? He sends her out of his house. So, Misha mishalcha ve'eina chozeret. Yatzta zosha mishalcha ve'chozeret. He sends her out of the house, and there's a divorce. Now, if she's a shotah and has no understanding, she'll come right back to the house. She won't understand that the divorce separated between them. So if she's going to come right back into his house, that's not a divorce. So therefore, you can't divorce someone like that. So therefore, what is it referring to here? Lo tzricha diyodat lishmor gita ve'ena yodat lishmor atzma. So they come up with this middle ground. She can protect her get. She knows how to do that. And that's why it's a natural divorce on a Torah level. But she doesn't know how to watch her own body. And therefore, the rabbis say, keep her married to you because of that. Okay, so again, Dvar Torah Shotam Mitgareshet, in that case, on a Torah level, she could get divorced because she could Dahayodat Lishmor Gita, she can watch her get. But the rabbi said, Lo Lifka, Shalayina Guba Minag Hefker. Don't divorce her because people will mistreat her. Amar Rabbi. Dai Kanami de Katani Gabe Didan Nishtatet Lo Yotzi, Gabe Dide Lo Yotzi Olamit. I'm going to further prove to you this distinction that a man can't get divorced at all if he's a Cheresh, but a woman can get divorced on a Torah level, just not on a rabbinic level. Okay, so now they say, how do we know this? Because it says by her, nishtatet, if she becomes, right, remember, she was fine when she got married, but then she became a shotah, lo yotzi, he can't divorce her. The gabe didei, if he becomes a cheresh, it says lo yotzi olamit. He can't ever divorce her. That word olamit, they say, Maishnaha de katane olamit, forever. Umaishnahatam, by her, lo katane olamit, it doesn't say that. Ela shmamina ha deoraita ha derabanan. Ever means because it's Torah level. Doesn't say ever by her because theoretically he really could, he just shouldn't. I'm Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Now we're going to get to the next two parts of the Mishnah. We were talking about Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who basically says, why do you distinguish, like what's the reason for the distinction man and woman? By cheresh. So we buy them. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, ish pshitale v'isha kamebayale, or dilma isha pshitale v'ish kamebayale. Okay, what he says, I'm going to read you his question. Why does a woman who's divorced, who's deaf mute, can get divorced, but a man who becomes deaf can't divorce? So now they say, which part was obvious to him and which part wasn't? Okay, that we're assuming one he understood and the other one he was comparing to that one and saying, why is it different? So do we say, Ish pshitale, it was obvious to him that a man can't divorce his wife if he became deaf or mute while he was married already, because his marriage was right to begin with, and now he doesn't have the capability. V'isha kamebayale, and the question only was, why is a woman, why can she get divorced? O dilma isha pshitale, or maybe it was clear to him why the woman can. V'ish kamebayale, he was questioning about the man. Why can't the man divorce his wife? So Tashma, they're going to try to learn it, but then we're going to see that you could say both ways. So they, in the end, come up with a different explanation entirely of what he's saying. They say the man who gets divorced is not like a woman who gets divorced, which means that they're focusing on the man. They're explaining the man is not like the woman, which means he must have been asking about the man. To which they say, no, adarabah. What their answer was, when they answered, they said, if you remember, they said also the previous case, which talked about the woman is just like this because the woman we don't need her ratzon. Since they say, just like you see in the previous case with this woman, it was the woman who he was asking about. So shmamina isha kamebaile. So Ella, so they say it could go both ways. So in the end, they say, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri l'divrei kamri. Really, there's a debate. He's asking a question, lishitatam, according to their opinion. And this is the way we understand. Lididi, and now we find out, according to this explanation, there are two opinions about it. According to me, he thinks just like a man who becomes a cheresh can't get out, a woman who becomes a cheresh within her marriage can't get out of the marriage, can't get divorced. But according to you, then he's saying, according to you, though, why do you distinguish? And that's his question. To which they answer, and then they come and set up, these are two totally different things. He thinks they're the same, and they think they're two totally different things. Moving on. He'id Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgada. He testified about a chereshet, Shisiavia, that the father married her off. She was a chereshet, that she can get out by beget. So now they say the following. Me'eduto shel Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgada. The following case can be true. Okay, it's not that this case happened, even though it kind of sounds like it, but it sounds like what he's saying is, if there were to be a case like this, she'd be able to be divorced. Now, what's the case? A very unpleasant case. Amar le'edim. Okay, what they're basically saying is, the woman doesn't need ratzon to get married. She doesn't even really need to understand she's getting divorced. That's what's clear here. It's not just ratzon, but it's also understanding, because this chereshet can get divorced, even though in this, right? So now we're going to see. Amar le'edim. If he says to witnesses, Re'u get zeh shani noten, goes over to two people, he says, look, I'm giving this get to this woman. Va'amarla, and then he goes to his wife and he says, Kinsi shtar chov zeh. Go take this promissory note. Okay, even though he's giving her a get. So he dupes her entirely. She has no idea what he's doing. Hareza magulesh. She's divorced because what did we say? You don't need the ratzon of the woman. And this, right, and this chereshet can get divorced and all that. Milo amar Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudgada lo ba'inan data. You don't need her knowledge. Hachanami lo ba'inan data. To which the Gemara says, instead of questioning how could you possibly do this, the Gemara actually says, pshita. Obviously, you don't need it. Why are you even telling us this? We know you don't need the ratzon of the woman. So what's the difference if she understands or not? So they said, well, what he was trying to say is, since it says take this promissory note, maybe he was canceling the get. Maybe he was saying, I don't really want to give her a get, even though a minute ago he said to the witnesses, watch, I'm going to give her a get. Maybe he's undoing it by saying, I'm giving you this promissory note. Saying, not saying I'm giving you a get. Kamash malan. So what Rava comes to teach you is, since a minute ago he said to the Edim, I'm giving this get to this woman, watch me. And then he doesn't tell them I'm not giving it to her. We assume he's sticking to his word. Now, when we delo amar le'edim, and since he didn't tell the Edim, he was doing it lo batli velo midi. So now what's left to explain? Why on earth did he say to her, I'm giving you a promissory note? Now we thought he was duping her. Now we're going to learn, no. He didn't want to humiliate her in front of people and say, I'm divorcing you. Like it would make her embarrassed, even though the witnesses knew it. But she doesn't know the witnesses know it. And she would be embarrassed that he's saying in public, I'm divorcing you. So he says it in other words, I'm giving you this promissory note, which really means I'm giving you a divorce, but without embarrassing her and humiliating her in front of other people. And that's how he understands this case. But again, it does show that you don't need the ratzon of the woman, and it even sounds like the knowledge of the woman, because it's not clear. She understood what he was saying, and therefore, now, by the way, this isn't a chereshet. This is a woman who has the capability of knowledge, but she doesn't have knowledge right now because he's not saying it explicitly, right? It's a bit of a crazy case, I have to say. Okay, and as I promised, tomorrow we're going to start with this idea of this katan ochel nevelo, that you don't have to stop him, or maybe you do, or what's the situation there? Very fascinating situation. So wait until tomorrow before you start letting your kids do whatever they want. Okay, have a great day, everybody. We'll meet up tomorrow.